Have you been wondering about oil tanks if you're buying a home? This is the video for you. Everything you need to know about oil tanks if you're a home buyer. This is especially prevalent where the majority of my team is in New Jersey, where there are underground oil tanks and above ground oil tanks. You are most concerned with underground oil tanks. I'm going to give you all the information that I know from years and years of dealing with them. So, why are underground oil tanks bad? Potentially, they're not all bad. The problem is that sometimes the oil tank can leak. Something can happen in it and there's leakage. So if it's still in use, normally a homeowner will be able to tell because their bills will be going quicker. They'll be running through oil quicker. What's the problem if oil is leaking out of the bottom of an underground tank? It means that oil is going to inside the ground. So that's not good. Oil is a contaminant, and the DEP needs to protect against that. So when you're buying a home and it has an underground oil tank, there are two different ways. It can be active, which means it's still heating the house. That's a little bit better, but can still be leaking. And then there's an inactive or abandoned oil tank where it needs to be pulled out. In reality, you really want both of them pulled out. If you're a home buyer, you can get insured with an underground oil tank that is existing and connecting. You can do soil testing around it, probably going to be about 90% accurate for the leak, not 100%. But if you have an abandoned oil tank or you find one doing an oil tank scan, those you're going to want to pull. And at least in New Jersey, all sellers are really going to be on the hook for that for the most part, unless it's disclosed in advance that they're not going to. And the reason why is nobody wants to take that risk. To pull a tank is going to be between $1,600 and $2,000. If there's a drop of oil and it needs to be processed, that's going to be another $7,500 for testing. And then if you hit the jackpot like I have in the past, you could have oil that's leaking, hits a water source, and you could be looking at $100,000. Does that make you want to do an oil tank sweep? You should never buy a home in an area where there have been underground oil tanks without doing a sweep. Even if the prior seller pulled a tank and you see all the paperwork, that doesn't mean that there's not a second tank. You never know what you're going to find. It costs like $250 to $300 to do it as part of your home inspection. And you need to be clear that there's nothing under the ground that could be contaminating your soil that could lead you to long-term damage and issues that you have to pay for. So when you have an above ground oil tank, people start to freak out because they hear oil. Those are fine. If they're leaking, which they're almost never, they leak into the basement, and your only issue would be if there's cracks in the basement that go into the ground. So normally it's going to be taken care of, cleaned, and fixed when you see it inside because you can see it. On the outside, it's underground. You can't see it. The only way you know if your bills start going, you're going through oil quicker. So one, get an oil tank sweep as part of your home inspection. That's going to keep you safe. If you do find an abandoned oil tank, you're going to ask the seller to pull it out. If they don't want to, what you're going to say is, hey, look, the next person's going to do the same thing. Nobody except an experienced investor is going to buy a tank with an existing abandoned oil tank. Some will with an oil tank that's working. I've bought houses that were on oil. They were working fine. And it was above ground, by the way. So you're going to negotiate that with the seller. Normally the seller is going to have to pull it. If it's clean when it comes out, meaning there's no droplets, going to pass a town inspection. You're going to get an NFA, which is no further action from the town, and then you're clear to go. They're going to dispose of the tank, and then you can do what you want. If you're connected, you can always convert to gas afterwards. Sometimes you have to adjust the furnace in that situation. But the main thing you're looking out for is a disaster scenario, and you don't want to take on something that is an environmental hazard when you're a new first-time home buyer. So if your agent tells you, hey, there's an abandoned underground tank, and you say, is that bad? It's bad. You're not taking that on as a first-time home buyer. We won't let you. I mean, it's just too risky. We don't want the liability that you have out there. Soil testing, again, isn't completely accurate. You got to get the seller to pull the tank. And if they're not willing to, let somebody else deal with it. If you have any other questions about oil tanks, put it in the comments. Our comments have been really blowing up. We've had some great responses, so I'm happy to pop in and answer any questions you have about oil tanks in New Jersey. I'm starting to move who I am to the end because if you're on here, you've probably seen me before. My name is Jonathan Green. I run a big real estate team in the state of New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. It's called Streamline Properties on Market. We're brokered by eXp Realty. We also work off market, so we do deal with a lot of properties where there are potential oil tank hazards that we have to work through. Our off market arm is Streamline Properties. And I hope this has been helpful. We have more coming, tips and tricks to help you as home buyers, sellers, or investors.